Castles are medieval buildings which were defensive homes for powerful people. They could be made from wood, stone, or brick, and some were used for hundreds of years. Thousands of castles were built across Europe, the Middle East, and Japan with different designs. Today, most castles are ruins and many are popular tourist attractions. In England and Wales, castles were first used by the invading Normans led by Duke William in 1066. They provided a base for lord of the castle to control the surrounding area and govern their land. Castles were designed to be imposing, their massive defenses deterred attackers and showed the owner's strength. A few troops in a castle could defend themselves against a much larger army. The most common method for taking a castle would be to besiege or storm it. Each had problems. Storming a castle would kill many of the attackers, but a siege would take a long time. Both methods sometimes failed. Castles were first built in the 9th century and the practice continued up to the 16th century. A castle was both a home for someone important like a king or noble, and a fort. Castles were designed to keep people out and show how powerful the people inside were. They were sometimes used in war, with many famous sieges like the Siege of Kenilworth in 1266 which lasted for 6 months, or Stirling Castle which was besieged 8 times. Castles could look very strong, but sometimes the defenses were mostly for show. The moat around Bodiam Castle is not very deep and could be drained by an attacking army, so was not very practical as a defense. But it made the castle look very impressive, and look bigger than it really is. If the owner of a castle rebelled against their ruler, they might be punished by having their castle demolished, known as slighting. Castles were built in Europe and the Middle East, with similar buildings developing separately in Japan in the 15th century. Castles were usually built from either wood or stone, and sometimes brick. Some castles started off as wooden and were then rebuilt in stone, which was more expensive and stronger so that the castles could be bigger. They could be built on hills or low areas like the edge of towns or at river crossings. There is the widely held idea that castles were always built on high hills. While there are some castles which make dramatic use of the landscape and are highly visible, there were a lot of factors in choosing where to build castles and only a minority were on hills. For example, many castles were built along the Rhine River so they could stop people using the river without permission. Depending on the exact definition, the number of castles varies and more castles are still being discovered. The numbers below are rough, and it is difficult to find estimates for some countries like Italy and Spain, though they have many castles. Imitation castles have been built in the 19th and 20th century, like Neuschwanstein, or some places in the United States, but these are not considered genuine castles as they were not meant to be defensive. The powerful people who built castles also lived in them with their families. They would have servants and a group of people to make sure the castle worked, people fetching water, cooking, clearing the stables, looking after animals, cooking, lighting fires, and checking who was coming into the castle. In peacetime, most castles only had a few soldiers who would guard the place. Today, most castles have bare stone walls inside, but in the Middle Ages they looked very different. Important rooms had colorful tapestries hanging on the walls, and paintings on the ceiling. Other rooms like kitchens or cupboards had plain white walls. Fireplaces kept rooms warm, and candles were used for light at night or in dark rooms. Glass was used later in the Middle Ages, but windows had shutters to keep out the cold and the weather. Religion was an important of the Middle Ages, and castles usually had chapels so that the people who lived there could pray. Later in the Middle Ages, important people wanted more privacy and larger homes. It was easier to build new homes instead of trying to make the castles bigger, so some people moved out of castles into new homes. The use of gunpowder weapons also changed warfare and made castles less effective. Guns were introduced in the 14th century, and by the 15th and 16th centuries they were powerful enough to break castle walls. New types of fortification were invented, with shorter, thicker walls, and using earth to absorb hits from cannonballs. Though cannons were powerful, castles were still used in war. In the 17th century, Lots of castles were used in the English Civil War, though many of them had not been lived in for decades and needed repairs. As castles were built hundreds of years ago, most of them are ruins. Some are still lived in by wealthy families, or are still used by governments or armies. Because of this, they might have changed and look different to old castles which were abandoned. Many castles have been turned into museums so the public can visit and learn about the past. Some castles are owned by the state, and others are owned by private people. Castles are expensive to run, so many are falling down. Every so often lightning strikes, flooding, or earthquakes damage castles. People have been interested in castle for centuries. Historians and archaeologists have searched old documents and dug into castles to find out more about them. Because of this, for some castles we know who owned them, when they were used, when bits were built, what people ate, and what kind of things happened at castles. But there are lots of places where we know very little, not even when they were built. This is because a lot of medieval documents do not survive. Some castle ruins have been rebuilt to look like they did originally. Also, many mock castles have been built, primarily in Europe and North America, predominantly during the 19th and 20th centuries. European-style castles originated in the 9th and 10th centuries, after the fall of the Carolingian Empire resulted in its territory being divided among individual lords and princes. These nobles built castles to control the area immediately surrounding them, and the castles were both offensive and defensive structures. They provided a base from which raids could be launched as well as offered protection from enemies. Although their military origins are often emphasized in castle studies, the structures also served as centers of administration and symbols of power. Urban castles were used to control the local populace and important travel routes, and rural castles were often situated near features that were integral to life in the community, such as mills, fertile land, or a water source. Many northern European castles were originally built from earth and timber, but had their defenses replaced later by stone. Early castles often exploited natural defenses, lacking features such as towers and arrow slits and relying on a central keep. In the late 12th and early 13th centuries, a scientific approach to castle defense emerged. This led to the proliferation of towers, with an emphasis on flanking fire. Many new castles were polygonal or relied on concentric defense, several stages of defense within each other that could all function at the same time to maximize the castle's firepower. These changes in defense have been attributed to a mixture of castle technology from the Crusades, such as concentric fortification, and inspiration from earlier defenses, such as Roman forts. Not all the elements of castle architecture were military in nature, so that devices such as moats evolved from their original purpose of defense into symbols of power. Some grand castles had long winding approaches intended to impress and dominate their landscape. Although gunpowder was introduced to Europe in the 14th century, it did not significantly affect castle building until the 15th century, when artillery became powerful enough to break through stone walls. While castles continued to be built well into the 16th century, new techniques to deal with improved cannon fire made them uncomfortable and undesirable places to live. As a result, true castles went into decline and were replaced by artillery forts with no role in civil administration, and country houses that were indefensible. From the 18th century onwards, there was a renewed interest in castles with the construction of mock castles, part of a romantic revival of Gothic architecture, but they had no military purpose. A keep seen from a river, rising behind a gate. The keep is large, square in plan, and has 4 cornered towers, 3 square and 1 round, all topped by lead cupolas. The Norman White Tower, the keep of the Tower of London, exemplifies all uses of a castle, including city defense, a residence, and a place of refuge in times of crisis. The word castle is derived from the Latin word castellum, which is a diminutive of the word castrum, meaning fortified place. The Old English castle, Occitan castle, or chastel, French chateau, Spanish castillo, Portuguese castello, Italian castello, and a number of words in other languages also derive from castellum. The word castle was introduced into English shortly before the Norman conquest to denote this type of building, which was then new to England. In its simplest terms, the definition of a castle accepted amongst academics is a private fortified residence. This contrasts with earlier fortifications, such as Anglo-Saxon burhs and walled cities such as Constantinople and Antioch in the Middle East. Castles were not communal defenses but were built and owned by the local feudal lords, either for themselves or for their monarch. Feudalism was the link between a lord and his vassal where, in return for military service and the expectation of loyalty, the lord would grant the vassal land. In the late 20th century, there was a trend to refine the definition of a castle by including the criterion of feudal ownership, thus tying castles to the medieval period. However, this does not necessarily reflect the terminology used in the medieval period. During the First Crusade, 1096-1099, the Frankish armies encountered walled settlements and forts that they indiscriminately referred to as castles, but which would not be considered as such under the modern definition. A castle, seen at the end of a long avenue, lit pink and red by the sunset. The castle gives an impression of tremendous size, and has an imposing, twin-towered gatehouse and, to the left, a large round keep. Windsor Castle in England was founded as a fortification during the Norman conquest and today is one of the principal official residences of Queen Elizabeth II. Bobovita medieval castle built on the banks of the Danube in Vidin, Bulgaria. Castles served a range of purposes, the most important of which were military, administrative, and domestic. As well as defensive structures, castles were also offensive tools which could be used as a base of operations in enemy territory. Castles were established by Norman invaders of England for both defensive purposes and to pacify the country's inhabitants. As William the Conqueror advanced through England, he fortified key positions to secure the land he had taken. Between 1066 and 1087, he established 36 castles such as Warwick Castle, which he used to guard against rebellion in the English Midlands. Towards the end of the Middle Ages, castles tended to lose their military significance due to the advent of powerful cannons and permanent artillery fortifications. As a result, castles became more important as residences and statements of power. A castle could act as a stronghold and prison but was also a place where a knight or lord could entertain his peers. Over time the aesthetics of the design became more important, as the castle's appearance and size began to reflect the prestige and power of its occupant. Comfortable homes were often fashioned within their fortified walls. Although castles still provided protection from low levels of violence in later periods, eventually they were succeeded by country houses as high-status residences. Castle is sometimes used as a catch-all term for all kinds of fortifications and, as a result, has been misapplied in the technical sense. An example of this is Maiden Castle which, despite the name, is an Iron Age hill fort which had a very different origin and purpose. Although castle has not become a generic term for a manor house, like chateau in French and Schloss in German, many manor houses contain castle in their name while having few if any of the architectural characteristics, usually as their owners liked to maintain a link to the past and felt the term castle was a masculine expression of their power. In scholarship the castle, as defined above, is generally accepted as a coherent concept, originating in Europe and later spreading to parts of the Middle East, where they were introduced by European crusaders. This coherent group shared a common origin, dealt with a particular mode of warfare, and exchanged influences. In different areas of the world, analogous structures shared features of fortification and other defining characteristics associated with the concept of a castle, though they originated in different periods and circumstances and experienced differing evolutions and influences. For example, Shiro in Japan, described as castles by historian Stephen Turnbull, underwent a completely different developmental history, were built in a completely different way and were designed to withstand attacks of a completely different nature. While European castles built from the late 12th and early 13th century onwards were generally stone, Shiro were predominantly timber buildings into the 16th century. By the 16th century, When Japanese and European cultures met, fortification in Europe had moved beyond castles and relied on innovations such as the Italian Trace Italian and star forts. Forts in India present a similar case. When they were encountered by the British in the 17th century, castles in Europe had generally fallen out of use militarily. Like Shiro, the Indian forts, Durga or Durg in Sanskrit, shared features with castles in Europe, such as acting as a domicile for a lord as well as being fortifications. They too developed differently from the structures known as castles that had their origins in Europe. Some terms you might find people using when they talk about castles. Bailey, an area of a castle surrounded by a wall or bank to keep people out. Keep, a large tower. Motte, a mound of earth which had a tower on top. Motte and bailey, a castle with a mound of earth with an enclosed area next to it. Rampart, a bank of earth, usually next to a ditch. Ringwork, a circular castle with a bank and ditch. Sliding, deliberately damaging a castle. Turret, a small tower.